Hi everyone, Paul Tavares here and welcome to The Bubble, a brand new video podcast series in which we look back on the week and discuss all of the major political events affecting London. As always, I'm joined by the irrepressible Roger Evans, former Deputy Mayor of London, who will provide all of the expert knowledge, analysis and insights in order to help us better understand how those events will affect Londoners right across the capital. Roger, it's great to see you. How are you, my friend?
Good morning, Paul. It's good to be back. It's been an interesting week, hasn't it, in the political world? I think every week is interesting at the moment, not necessarily in a good way. So I think we've got plenty to talk about.
Absolutely. And on that note, I'd like to start with the public argument, I suppose, between the government and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, because earlier this week, the Prime Minister accused Sadiq Khan of effectively bankrupting Transport for London, or TfL. The Mayor of London countered that by saying that actually TfL's finances prior to the COVID pandemic were in a far healthier state of affairs than they were when he took over from the previous mayor, which actually was the Prime Minister. He said that the operating deficit was down hugely by about 86%, and that operating costs were down each year. Sean Bailey, the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London, said that actually that wasn't a true reflection of TfL's finances, because actually their debt had increased by about £2.6 billion since he took over. £640 million had been lost in fares revenue due to the fares freeze and other transport policies. Just under £1.4 billion was lost due to delays in Crossrail, and the number of TfL executives earning more than £100,000 per year has risen to an astonishing 557 since Sadiq Khan took over as Mayor of London. As a result, what we did see earlier this year, prior to the pandemic, was a bailout from the government worth around £1.7 billion. So my question to you is, I suppose, Roger, is who's right here? Did Sadiq Khan bankrupt TfL, or is the opposite true?
Well, I think the important thing to bear in mind whenever we talk about TfL's finances is that they make 72% of their income from fares. And that's a very large proportion compared to other transport authorities around the world, where you generally be looking at around 30 to 40% of the income coming from fares and the rest from other sources. And that means that whatever happens to the fare box is actually going to impact on TfL's overall budget. So that's where you need to look. And you're right, the first indication of a problem really was when the mayor decided to freeze fares. Now, we've had fares frozen before, and Ken Livingstone had a history of maybe freezing fares for a couple of years, then allowing them to drift up to make back the ground which had been lost. Sadiq was different. He actually instituted a continuing fares freeze with no increases. And of course, because costs increase every year, that means that every year it becomes harder to balance the budget. Now, Transport for London, certainly during the years I was at City Hall, were running a big surplus every year because not only did they make a profit on fares, but the number of passengers went up every year. And in fact, we came to rely on that when setting the budget. And the model of freezing fares and continuing to make a profit very much relies on the number of passengers continuing to grow. And we could see some problems with that before the current crisis. But I think the thing that really hit hard a couple of years ago was when the Crossrail project was delayed. Because of course, Crossrail would have meant a whole bunch of extra people using the tube and a big increase in the number of passengers and the fares income. So they've had to do without that increase that they were hoping for, really from the end of 2018 when Crossrail was supposed to open. And they've had additional costs because of course they've actually been running Crossrail to test it. So all the costs associated with the railway have been there, but none of the income line. And in fact, what we saw earlier this year, really before the pandemic had got a grip, was a reduction in Transport for London's credit rating, which reflected the loss of fares income which had happened so far. And that in itself is a problem, of course, because to build Crossrail, to do all the tube improvements, Transport for London needs to borrow billions of pounds of money. And it had a very good interest rate to borrow those on, but when your credit rating falls, your interest rates go up. So that's another cost which they then have to carry as well. Now, all of that was showing red lights on TfL's budget dashboard before 2020 arrived. And of course, it's just been blown out of the water completely by what's happened with COVID, because COVID has massively reduced the number of people using both the buses and the underground. That model, which relied on a number of passengers continuing to rise year after year, is now broken. And it may be broken irreparably, because we don't know what's going to happen when COVID blows itself out, whether people will still be returning to the city or whether they'll be working at home in larger numbers, whether we will see a revitalization of local areas around London, which have been losing business to the centre. So it could be that Transport for London will, in the longer term, have to rethink their budget and the way it works. And it might be that the government needs to actually provide more of a subsidy to keep Transport for London on its feet in the longer term.
The Mayor of London has also asked for an additional TfL bailout in the region of around £4.7 billion. In light of the dramatic fall in passenger numbers and the subsequent drop in fare revenues, the money is intended to maintain London's public transport system until such time that the COVID pandemic situation is resolved. The Mayor, however, has publicly said that the governments are attaching certain strings to any potential bailout, including the extension of the congestion charge all the way up to the north and south circular roads, increasing the precept, which means an overall increase in council tax charges for all Londoners, cutting free travel to the under 18s and over 60s, and increasing fares for all passengers. Quite interestingly, though, Chris Philp, the Conservative MP for Croydon South, appeared on the Sunday Politics show last week, and he categorically denied that the government had insisted on an increase to the congestion charge. Now, obviously, Sadiq Khan came out and dismissed that as untrue. However, later in the week, Grant Shapps, Business Secretary, appeared before Parliament.
We have gone to the Mayor with a long list of different things that he could do. It's up to him what he does, but I want to make it absolutely clear to the House. It is his choice, and we are not going to require him to extend the congestion charge anywhere.
Sadiq Khan then took to social media and published an extract of a letter that he had received from Grant Shapps on the 1st of October, and I'll just read that quick little excerpt for you. In the letter, he says, "We also propose the extension of the Central Line congestion charging zone to cover the same area as the ultra-low emission zone." So my question to you, Roger, is what on earth is going on? One side says one thing, the other side says the opposite. I mean, who exactly is telling the truth? What exactly is going on?
Well, I'm sure the government will have attempted to attach conditions to a bailout for Transport for London. After all, TfL are asking for in the region of £5 billion of taxpayers' money, and we'd expect our government to attach some conditions and some expectations. And it's no different really to the money which they're using to bail out other parts of the UK, particularly the northern cities, which are suffering particularly badly from COVID at the moment. The argument seems to hinge on whether this letter from Grant Shapps was a list of things the Mayor could choose from, or a list of things which were all mandatory. And it's difficult to come to a conclusion without being able to see the whole of the letter, of course. I am surprised, actually, that congestion charge was included in that list, whether it was a mandatory list or a list of choice, because Conservative politicians in London, including Chris Philp, including Grant Shapps when he's done activism work in London, and particularly, of course, Boris Johnson when he was mayor, had a record of actually opposing congestion charge. In fact, Boris Johnson, of course, presided over the removal of the western extension of the congestion charge zone. So he presided over it being reduced in size. So as a political objective, I'm surprised that that was allowed to remain in the letter, particularly because actually the amount of money congestion charge raises is not very large when you consider the whole of the Transport for London budget. Really, the only game in town for raising money for the TfL budget in substantial amounts is actually fares. So you'd be looking at a fares increase, and other measures are peripheral. If you wanted to look at other measures to raise a bit of money towards TfL, I think Shapps might have been well advised to take a look at some of the things that Assembly members have recommended over the years. So, for instance, sponsorship of London Underground stations, where you can find people who are willing to link their businesses to them. Better use of Transport for London's property portfolio. Remember, they own property in the highest value part of the country, and there's a lot that you can gain from development and from commercial activity. Better use of the advertising budget, so encouraging people to advertise on public transport without all of the rules around different types of advertising that are forbidden, that Sadiq Khan has introduced. So there are plenty of smaller things of the same size as the congestion charge increase that they could have proposed instead. But I think the bottom line really comes down to fares increases. And if at the end of the day, the deal ends up with Sadiq getting his way and getting the money without any strings attached, then the Exchequer will still have to pay for it. The taxpayer is still going to have to pay for it. And of course, London generates the lion's share of tax in the UK. So by hook or by crook, Londoners are going to end up paying for it one way or another. I can see how the arguments develop, but I don't think that people are being entirely straight with us. And if we wanted to know the absolute truth, releasing the whole letter rather than excerpts from it would be a good start.
Well, setting aside TfL for one moment, but still focusing on the Mayor of London, I have to say, Sadiq Khan is a very bewildering and confusing individual. I struggle to understand him at times, because in response to the COVID pandemic, the Mayor of London lobbied the government to implement the 10 p.m. curfew on hospitality venues, but then later demanded that the government scrap the policy because of the detrimental impact it was having on the industry. He demanded London go into full lockdown. Now, failing that, he lobbied the government to place London in Tier 2 restrictions, even though at the time, London qualified for Tier 1. When the government obliged, he then criticised them, complaining that the move was a bad thing. So far, we seem to have seen a lot of political shifting from the Mayor of London at a critical time when I think strong leadership and a clear vision as to how London will emerge from this disastrous situation is probably needed most. But so far, we've not seen any of that from the Mayor of London. So my question to you, Roger, is why do you think that is? Why are we not seeing that strong leadership and clear vision from Sadiq Khan?
One of the things about COVID is it's been a very bad, it's reflected very badly on devolved government throughout the UK. Remember, everyone is getting the same scientific advice. Admittedly, it changes because we're in a situation where scientists don't have a lot of prior knowledge. So as new evidence becomes available, their advice changes. But what we've seen is that advice being interpreted in different ways by devolved administrations. And of course, the latest example is the ruling from the Welsh government that you can only buy essential items in shops now. And of course, that creates questions around what is an essential item, and the government telling you what you're allowed to buy and what you're not allowed to buy. And there's that whole awful can of worms that that they've been tempted to interfere with, and at least Sadiq hasn't gone down that road yet. I was surprised by his enthusiasm for the 10 p.m. curfew. I think in London there is an additional problem with that curfew, and it was identified by Andy Byford, the Commissioner for Transport, when he appeared in front of the committee a couple of weeks ago, which is that if you close all the venues in the centre of town at 10 p.m, then you empty everyone out onto the streets at once, and they all go flooding onto the tube and onto buses, and they're all squashed together. And of course, it's the ideal environment for transmitting infection. And that's been created by the 10 p.m. curfew. So I think a better result in London would have been to have a staggered closing approach, where you allowed venues to close over a period of time and people to leave them and to head home in over a longer period of time, rather than in one rush, which is what you've got now. So that's something which I think the mayor was unwise to press, and I'm surprised he did. He's got a night czar, remember, and a lot of connections into the entertainment industry in London, and you'd thought that those people would have been able to tell him what would happen if you closed everything at the same time. It's just common sense, really. But I think the mayor is not unusual amongst devolved administrations here. He's following the advice, but he's trying to follow it in a way that makes him look different to the government. He's wanting to distance himself from government decisions in case they prove to be unpopular in future, I think. And it's a pattern we can see with Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench, as well as with the administrations in Scotland and in Wales too.
Whilst on the subject of the hospitality industry, earlier this week we saw London's West End restaurants and bars issue a very dire warning, saying that after what they termed a horrendous first week of Tier 2 restrictions, saying that they wouldn't survive the winter if things continued as they are, effectively. And so many across the hospitality industry took to London streets in protest at the impact that the government's COVID policies were having on the sector. But it looks like the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has come in with a very timely and much needed support package to help the hospitality industry. What did you think of that intervention? Is it enough to protect the industry during these difficult times? And is it a sustainable economic strategy, in your opinion?
I think it was a good move, and the hospitality industry will be pleased by it. I know a few people around our corner of Essex who own restaurants and bars, and they were worried about the effects of COVID, and so they'll be able to sleep a little bit easier with this package now. In the long term, of course, more support may be required. We don't know whether there will be another wave after this one. We don't know whether there will be long-term effects on the economy of the city. One of the interesting things about hospitality in London is, I've been out during the pandemic, and when I go to a bar in the centre of town, there's usually just me and a couple of other people, and the guy who's running it has plenty of time to come and talk to me about their worries, because they're not doing anything else. Yet if I go out in Romford town centre, where I live, every day is like a Saturday. The contrast is incredible. Everything is busy here all the time. And clearly what's happened, and not just here, but in centres around outer London, is that the people who would have travelled into town for their entertainment in the past are now using local venues instead and not getting onto public transport. So we're seeing something of a revitalisation of high streets in outer London. Although whether that will continue, of course, once we get back to normal is questionable as well. But we shouldn't allow our focus on short-term bailing out businesses and short-term measures to support them, which we're rightly introducing. We shouldn't allow that to interfere with work which needs to be done on what the long-term viability is now of the hospitality, the nighttime economy. Where are people likely to be going in future? How has COVID maybe changed people's socializing patterns after it's out of the way? There may well be long-term changes in the hospitality industry as we're expecting long-term changes in working practices as well now.
It's a difficult situation for all involved, without doubt. Changing subjects now somewhat though. Footballer Marcus Rashford has been pushing the government to extend the free school meals initiative to cover the half-term period. But the decision to do so was voted down in Parliament. In your view, why did the government reject the proposal, and did they make the right decision?
It's on occasions like this that I'm quite pleased that I'm not still in politics, because I think I would have found it very difficult if I was a member of Parliament to support the government on this. It's one of those measures which is not in the round when you look at the amount of money being spent on other things, going to cost a great deal, and the optics of what has happened for the government and the Conservative Party have not been good. And at the back of my mind, if I was a backbencher, would always be the concern that, having gone through the battle, as soon as they saw it was looking bad in the media, the government would U-turn on it anyway. So, which they've done a fair bit of over the last year. So I'd have found it difficult to support them on this, and I wasn't surprised that some Conservative members of Parliament rebelled and voted against the government, and I think one ministerial aide actually quit her job over it. That said, I think perhaps the longer term concern could be about the precedent that's set. So you can provide support for a half term without it incurring a great deal of cost, but what if that sets a precedent and you have to then provide the same support over the Christmas holidays or over a longer period? What if that support ceases to be an emergency response to COVID and becomes a constant feature of your spending? And government will be keen not to create too many precedents in the current climate, because of course, as we've seen with free travel, it's a lot easier to give these people things than it is to claw them back afterwards.
Just sadly, our time is up once again. As always, thank you so much for your invaluable contribution. I guess I will see you same time, same place next week. To you at home, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like this video and subscribe so that you can receive notifications every time we upload a new video to the channel. Also, please help us spread the word so that we can grow the channel, because it's so important that people know and understand how political events unfolding will impact their lives and that of those within their community. And we can only really do that with your help. So please spread word about The Bubble, about this new video podcast series. Until then, be sure to leave a comment down below and let us know what subjects and topics you'd like us to cover next time. And also be sure to leave your name and let us know where you're from, so that we can give you a mention next time. But until then, have a great week, and we'll see you then. Take care.